You may not believe me when I tell you, what you are currently witnessing is real footage captured by a paranormal investigation team. It is said that in an abandoned mental asylum known as Collingwood in Canada, numerous inexplicable and eerie events have taken place. This hospital, constructed in 1893, once housed over 100,000 psychiatric patients but was abruptly shut down in 1963. The reason for this was that the psychopathic director had experimented on the brains of his patients by brutally removing the frontal lobes of thousands of them. The dean, however, suffered the fate he deserved when he was brutally murdered in his office by several escaped patients. Once this horrifying incident came to light, the hospital was permanently closed. Strange occurrences began shortly after, with passers-by often hearing the eerie laughter of patients emanating from the hospital at night. Some even saw ghosts in the hospital, so the hospital became known as a haunted hospital. A paranormal investigation team known as Grave Encounters learned about these hauntings and decided to visit the hospital to document these supernatural events. They chose to use the mental asylum as the subject of their next documentary. Despite having filmed over a dozen episodes involving paranormal phenomena, they had never encountered what they considered to be actual ghosts before. They never believed in ghosts either. After learning about the hospital from the locals, they entered the hospital under the guidance of Kenny, the caretaker. On the locked door, the words "Death is waiting for you" were written. Kenny also said that he often heard some strange noises. He proceeded to show them several particularly eerie spots, such as windows that mysteriously opened by themselves at night, patient rooms covered in mysterious symbols on the walls, and a particularly horrifying bathroom where a female patient had tragically ended her own life. Finally, there's an underground passageway that connects all the buildings, and the whole passageway reveals an eerie atmosphere, as if you can never see the end. Before filming began, Lance called in an expert, Houston, who specialized in ghosts. Houston immediately sensed that something was amiss in this place. Even as they entered the hospital, in the bathroom where the female patient committed suicide, Houston sensed an extremely powerful grudge.
C'è dell'acqua rossa. C'è dell'acqua rossa. Molto sangue.
The atmosphere is getting more and more tense, but in the next second, they suddenly burst into laughter. It turned out that the so-called master was just an actor they hired to add to the horror effect. Soon it was dark. Matt, the surveillance operator, then set up cameras in all parts of the hospital, especially those places where there were paranormal incidents. Being a professional film crew, they came equipped with an array of high-end equipment, including an electromagnetic field detector to monitor the stability of the surroundings, an infrared sensor to detect changes in environmental temperature, and a specialized recorder capable of capturing sounds beyond the range of human hearing. With everything set up, Lance decided to add some suspense to this episode by locking the entire team inside the hospital for 6 hours. Kenny would return at 6 a.m. the following morning to unlock the doors. As the team gathered and chanted their team slogan, the official filming commenced. They began testing various spots where paranormal activity had been reported, attempting to make contact with the legendary ghosts using their high-tech instruments. However, the results yielded no abnormalities. Lance, using a paranormal camera, roamed around the premises but failed to capture any ghostly apparitions. The only disturbance came from a room infested with rats, which left them feeling disgusted. Unbeknownst to them, as they returned to the ground floor to take a break, something eerie was unfolding upstairs. A window that had been securely closed suddenly swung open, with less than 2 hours left until Kenny's scheduled return. To enhance the suspense for their viewers, Lance instructed the cameraman, TC, to capture more close-up shots. TC proceeded to explore the upper floors, initially encountering no unusual events. At first, he even received a phone call from his family. However, while on the phone, he failed to notice a wheelchair moving slightly behind him. Hanging up the phone, T.C. went to a toilet, only to have another horrifying scene occur. The steel door behind him slammed shut. TC thought it was a deliberate program effect by his colleague, but when TC came out of the toilet with a curse, he found the corridor empty again. He felt it was a bit weird, so he sent the others over right away. After some examination, they found that the door was so heavy that the wind couldn't blow it, and the window was closed, so there couldn't have been any wind. Reviewing the video footage recorded by TC, the team was shocked to witness these inexplicable events. This was the first time in over a dozen episodes of their show that they had encountered such bizarre occurrences. Once they calmed down, Lance attempted to communicate with whatever had closed the door, but received no response. Just when they were beginning to lose hope, it seemed as though the spirits had indeed heard their call. They immediately followed the sound and found that a hospital bed had been overturned and its wheels were still rolling, but they still didn't believe it, thinking that there might be other people in the hospital. So they started to look around. However, what happened next would completely shatter their understanding of reality. Sasha took out a tape recorder to see if she could record some inaudible sounds, but she did record some strange noises. As she focused on the recording, a mysterious force suddenly pulled at her hair, leaving her in shock, desperate to leave the premises. In contrast, Lance was unusually excited, as he had never encountered paranormal events in all his years in the field. This episode was bound to go viral. After Sasha was escorted to the first floor, they continued filming in the hallway, but this time, there were no unusual sounds. Lance immediately decided to take some photos using a paranormal camera. Since photos needed to be developed to reveal their content, Lance was unaware that he had captured something unsettling. Returning to the lobby, they realized it was past 6 a.m., and Lance instructed everyone to pack up their equipment. Signaling the end of the shoot, Matt began retrieving the cameras placed throughout the hospital. However, when he reached the room where he had filmed the window, he discovered that the window was open. Matt wanted to call the others to come up and check it out, but the walkie-talkie was malfunctioning. Then he heard a noise from the corridor and Matt disappeared from the shot, never to be seen again. By the time the 4 remaining members in the lobby had finished packing up, more than an hour had passed. Yet, Matt had not returned. Lance tried to contact Matt on the walkie-talkie, but got no response. So, they decided to go upstairs immediately to look for Matt. But, aside from the abandoned filming equipment, they found no trace of him. In order to search more efficiently, Lance decided to split up. But when TC came to a stairwell, he was pushed down by something. Luckily, his injury was not very serious. Hearing the commotion, Lance and Sasha rushed to help TC back to the lobby, but after experiencing what had just happened, TC became increasingly agitated. He was sure he hadn't accidentally fallen, he had been pushed. T.C. didn't want to stay in this place for another minute. It was then that they realized more than an hour had passed since the scheduled opening time for the doors, and Kenny had not arrived. Had he overslept? Lance immediately dialed Kenny's number, only to find that the signal had suddenly been lost. TC, not wanting to wait any longer, pushed a hospital bed over to the door and tried to break it down. Lance saw that TC was getting more and more agitated, so he could only go up to help. When the doors were finally forced open, however, they were met with a bewildering sight. On the other side of the doors was another corridor. This defied logic. That's the door they came through. With trepidation, they continued down the corridor, only to find another door. Without hesitation, they kicked it open, only to be met by another dark hallway. At the end of this corridor was a window sealed with iron mesh. TC tries to open it, but it doesn't work. What's even weirder is that it's almost 9 o'clock in the morning. Dawn is supposed to be at 7:30, but it's still dark outside, which is clearly beyond the realm of scientific explanation. After trying various methods, they still couldn't find a way out. When they returned to the lobby, it was already 1 p.m. Since everyone was very tired at this time, they could only take a short rest in the hall. However, just as they were sleeping soundly, the lighting on the side was suddenly pushed down. This startled everyone. Lance checked the time and realized it was already 8 p.m. They wanted to eat something to replenish their energy, but they found that the fresh food they brought yesterday was already moldy and spoiled. They didn't want to sit around and wait for death. Even if they weren't scared to death, they would starve to death. And now only the underpass and the roof they haven't been to yet, so they planned to go to the rooftop first. As expected, this route was also blocked. Despite a sign pointing the way to the rooftop, they found the path sealed off by a wall. They reluctantly returned to the ground floor, but on their way back, they encountered what seemed like a supernatural barrier, a maze that kept them going in circles. Maps were useless at this point, and even the magnetic fields around them seemed chaotic. Frustrated and anxious, they suddenly heard Matt's cries for help. They hurriedly followed the sound to search for Matt, but apart from an empty hospital bed, they found no signs of Matt in the room. In the next instant, the hospital bed in the room lifted off the ground, leaving them in a state of shock. As they fled the room, they spotted a figure passing by them in a flash. Thinking it might be Matt, they pursued, only to discover it was a woman in a patient's gown. She stood silently facing the wall, an eerie sight. The group did not immediately sense the danger, and Lance bravely approached her, but in the next moment, they were all in a frantic panic. running around. As they fled into another room to take cover, they realized that Houston had not followed them. Houston was alone, looking for the others in a panic. To make matters worse, his flashlight ran out of battery at that very moment. Houston could only grope through the darkness, moving forward blindly. But if nothing else, Houston was on the verge of his final moments. Suddenly, Houston was lifted off the ground by an unseen force. After struggling to break free and falling to the floor, he was then thrown hundreds of meters away by a mysterious power. Poor Houston was then dropped dead. Meanwhile, on the other side, the three people who had woken up in the room found that each of them had a patient's ID tag on their wrists. It seems that they have all become patients in the mental hospital. After calming down, they began to explore their surroundings again, but this time, they encountered Matt, who had been missing for a while. Matt was dressed in patient's clothing, and he also had a patient's ID tag on his wrist. They immediately brought Matt into a room and tried to find out what had happened to him during his disappearance. However, Matt was now incoherent, as the fear and shock had taken a toll on his sanity. He said something they couldn't understand. By this time, the group was extremely fatigued and decided to rest on the spot. However, as they were getting into a deep sleep, they were suddenly awakened by a chorus of eerie cries and howls. They found the room surrounded by countless ghostly hands, a scene straight out of hell. They had no choice but to flee, but this time, they ended up in a familiar place, the bathroom where someone had previously committed suicide by cutting their wrists. Before they could catch their breath, Lance suddenly heard the sound of water. He got up to investigate and was horrified to find that the previously dry bathtub was now filled with red liquid. Realizing the danger, they tried to leave the bathroom, but when they turned around, they saw Matt standing silently next to the bathtub, his eyes fixed on it. TC reached out to pull Matt away, but Matt resisted. However, as TC cursed at the camera, a little cutie popped out of the bathtub and dragged him in. By the time Lance and the others overturned the bathtub, TC had completely disappeared. It's too late to be sad. The three quickly left the room. Then they came to a lift. The only place they haven't been before is the underground passage. From this lift, they can go straight down. However, since they couldn't open the elevator doors by hand, Lance had to find a tool. He soon found a steel pipe on a hospital bed in one of the rooms. As he was about to return with the tool, he noticed something had fallen in the corner. Lance approached for a closer look and was shocked to find that it was a severed tongue. Blood was dripping continuously from it, and when Lance looked up, he was nearly scared to death. He ran to the lift and finally pried open the door with a steel pipe. There was a ladder inside leading downward. Just as they were about to descend, they heard cries of agony from a distance. At this point, they should have just proceeded, but Lance insisted on going to investigate. As soon as he switched on the night vision device, the ghost without a tongue pounced on him. Sasha rushed up to help and finally blocked the ghost from the door. However, Matt, who had been silent throughout, picked up the camera, gave a vacant smile, and then jumped into the elevator shaft. When there was no movement outside, they realized Matt had fallen to his death. But at this moment, they could not care about the sadness, only the fear of losing their companions. The remaining two individuals reached the bottom of the elevator shaft and indeed found that it led to the underground tunnel. But will following the passageway lead them out? Obviously, it's not that simple. The passage seemed to be never-ending. They seemed to be caught in a dead loop, circling back to the same place, and even the way back was gone. At that moment, Sasha didn't know what had happened and suddenly kept spitting blood. The two of them could only sit helplessly on the ground, awaiting the arrival of death. Gradually, they fell asleep without realizing it, but not long after, the time on the camera seemed to be disturbed and became chaotic. A white smoke followed, instantly filling the entire tunnel. When the smoke slowly dissipated, Sasha had disappeared without a trace. When Lance woke up again, he called out Sasha's name repeatedly, but the tunnel echoed only with his lonely voice. Lance began an incessant search for Sasha, but the flashlight's battery was running low, and the camera's power wouldn't last much longer either. Desperate, Lance crouched on the ground and tremblingly used the recording device to inquire. But all he heard was a creepy wailing sound. After what felt like an eternity, when Lance woke up once more, he saw a door suddenly appear before him. He fearfully pushed the door open and found that it seemed to be a laboratory. Everywhere were images of patients' brains being dissected, along with various instruments used for experiments. Obviously, this place is the secret base where the perverted dean used to do brain experiments. As Lance explored the area, he suddenly noticed several doctors performing surgery on patients behind him. Panicked, Lance accidentally made a noise, but when he turned back once more, a doctor suddenly appeared before him with a terrifying and malevolent visage. The terrifying journey of the Grave Encounters team had come to an end, but the story of the mental hospital continued, because there are always people who refuse to believe until they experience it for themselves. And then they are in awe of the unknown.